They conquered kingdoms. They terrified empires. They marched where ordinary men would never dare to go. But every warrior, no matter how powerful, eventually faces the same enemy: death. Some died surrounded by thousands of enemies. Some were betrayed by the people closest to them. One died after a lifetime of war, and another simply vanished from the battlefield, leaving no body behind. These are the final moments of 7 legendary warriors in history. And at number 1, the most famous assassination in the ancient world. 1199. Richard the Lionheart had survived wars, rebellions, crusades, captivity, and countless battles. He had earned a reputation as one of Europe's greatest warrior kings. But his final battle would be against something far smaller than an army: a castle. At Chalus in France, Richard was besieging a small fortress. And then, from the walls, a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. It didn't look like the end. Richard was still alive. The bolt was removed, but the wound became infected, and the warrior who had survived some of the most dangerous battles of his age began losing a battle he could not win. His own body was turning against him. On April 6th, 1199, Richard died from the wound. The Lionheart had been brought down not by an army, but by a single bolt. But Richard's death was not the strangest ending on this list, because the next warrior spent the final years of his life running from the empire he once nearly destroyed. Hannibal Barca was the nightmare of Rome. He crossed the Alps with an army and elephants. He defeated Roman armies again and again. At Cannae, he delivered Rome one of the most devastating defeats in its history. But Hannibal could not defeat time. After Carthage lost the war, Hannibal's life became a long journey through exile and political intrigue. He sought refuge with foreign rulers, but Rome never forgot him. Eventually, Roman pressure reached the court of King Prusias of Bithynia. Hannibal realized the Romans were coming for him. He had spent his entire life fighting Rome, and now Rome wanted him alive. Hannibal refused to give them that victory. According to ancient accounts, he took poison rather than be captured. Imagine it, the man who once made Rome tremble, sitting alone at the end of his life, knowing the greatest enemy he had ever faced was finally at his door. Hannibal chose his own ending. But our next warrior didn't choose his fate. He was born into a kingdom already surrounded by enemies, and his own body was slowly destroying him. Jerusalem, the 12th century. A young king sits on the throne. His name was Baldwin IV, but Baldwin carried a terrible burden. He suffered from leprosy. Yet despite his illness, he became king at only 13. His kingdom stood under constant pressure from Saladin and the forces surrounding Jerusalem. Baldwin's body was becoming weaker, but his will remained terrifyingly strong. He continued to rule, he continued to fight, and he continued to appear before his enemies as a king who refused to disappear. But eventually, his illness became too powerful. In 1183, his nephew was crowned as co-king, because Baldwin could no longer carry the full burden of rule. 2 years later, in 1185, Baldwin IV died. He was only in his 20s. His life had become a battle between the king he wanted to be and the body he could no longer command. He couldn't defeat his illness, but he had refused to let it defeat his courage. And now, we go from a dying king to a rebel whose final battlefield became a legend. He was not born a king. He didn't inherit an empire. He wasn't surrounded by royal guards. He was a slave. His name was Spartacus. And when he escaped from gladiatorial captivity, he helped ignite one of the most famous slave revolts in Roman history. Thousands joined him. Roman forces were defeated, and for a moment, Rome looked vulnerable. But Rome eventually sent one man to crush the rebellion: Marcus Licinius Crassus. The Romans cornered Spartacus and his army. The final battle came. Spartacus reportedly fought directly against the Roman forces, attempting to reach Crassus himself, but his army was overwhelmed. Spartacus fell, and then came the mystery. The Romans never recovered his body. His army was destroyed. His rebellion was crushed, but Rome could never display Spartacus's corpse as a trophy. His body disappeared, while his name survived for more than 2,000 years. And now, we travel even further back, to a king who knew exactly what was waiting for him. 480 BC. The Persian Empire was advancing into Greece. Its army was enormous, Standing in its path was a small Greek force led by the Spartan king, Leonidas. At Thermopylae, the Greeks held the narrow pass. For a time, they stopped the Persian advance. But then came betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to move behind the Greek position. Leonidas now understood. The trap was closing. He could retreat, but he stayed. With the remaining defenders, Leonidas made his final stand. Spears shattered, shields collided, the battlefield became chaos, and eventually Leonidas fell. The Persian army won the field, but they had not broken the legend, because Leonidas didn't die believing he could survive. He died knowing exactly what his final stand meant, and yet, even Leonidas's death was not the most mysterious on this list, because our next warrior conquered an empire, and then died in circumstances historians still debate. He was 20 years old when he became king. Before he was 30, he had destroyed the Persian Empire. He had marched through Egypt, crossed Central Asia, reached India, and created one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, Alexander the Great. But in Babylon, in 323 BC, the conqueror stopped. Alexander became seriously ill. Day after day, his condition worsened. His soldiers gathered outside the palace, desperate to see their king one final time. He could barely move. And then, the man who had spent his life leading armies into battle could no longer lead himself out of his own bed. Alexander died at just 32 years old. The exact cause remains uncertain, and ancient accounts have generated centuries of debate. But the result was undeniable. The man who had conquered so much was defeated by death itself. His empire would soon fracture. His generals would fight over his legacy, but Alexander's name would survive. And now, we reach number 1. Not a battlefield, not an invading army, not an illness. A room filled with senators. Rome. March 15th, 44 BC. Julius Caesar had reached the highest point of power. He had conquered Gaul, defeated his political enemies, crossed the Rubicon, won a civil war, and become dictator of Rome. But some senators feared what Caesar was becoming. They believed Rome was losing its freedom, so they made a decision. Caesar had to die. On the Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate. Around him were men he knew, men he trusted. Then one senator approached. A request was made. Caesar refused. Another man moved closer, then another. Suddenly, the first blade struck. Caesar tried to fight back, but the attackers surrounded him. One wound became many, and among those conspirators was a man Caesar knew personally, Brutus. Whether Caesar's legendary final words were exactly as later writers claimed is uncertain. But the image became immortal. The dictator, surrounded by men who had once been part of his world. And finally, Caesar fell. Rome had killed the man who seemed almost impossible to defeat. But they had made one enormous mistake. They thought killing Caesar would end Caesar's story. Instead, it transformed him into a legend. Richard fell to a crossbow bolt. Hannibal chose his own death. Baldwin fought against a body that was failing him. Spartacus disappeared on a battlefield. Leonidas died standing against an empire. Alexander died before his dream was complete. And Caesar was betrayed by Rome itself. They were warriors, kings, conquerors, rebels. But history remembers something greater than how they died. It remembers that they lived large enough to become legends.